If you were to simply Google, is Tiny Tina's Wonderland a Borderlands game? It says it's a spin-off to the Borderlands franchise and a sequel to Tiny Tina's Attack on Dragon's Keep. But come on. It's basically a Borderlands game. But I'm not here to argue whether it's classed as a Borderlands game by definition, but rather if the game can compete with its predecessors. If you ever played Borderlands 1, 2, 3, or even the pre-sequel enough, you have some kind of understanding as to what makes a Borderlands game good or not. The franchise arguably peaked in Borderlands 2 by basically taking everything Borderlands 1 did right and expanding on it, but each game is good for their own reason. So does Wonderlands have what it takes to be classed as a true Borderlands game? So the way I'm going to do this is to first identify what makes a Borderlands game good, at least in my eyes, and then ranking the quality of how well Wonderlands does these things, or if they're even present at all. So to begin, I'll name the categories that we'll be covering and begin to break them down. So here we go. Farmable bosses, fun ways to traverse the map, good main story, good side quests, the weapon variety, including the rarities, DLCs, characters, including the abilities and leveling, and finally the endgame content. These are the main categories that make Borderlands games good or bad in my opinion. I'm sure there's a lot more I could talk about, but to keep it simple, this is what I'll discuss throughout the video. So, let's get started. In any Borderlands game, having farmable bosses is critical, and all of them have this feature. So, does Wonderlands? Of course it does, why wouldn't it? But beyond just senselessly killing a boss, for the fun of it, what is the purpose of farming bosses? Well, typically, aside from leveling, is to give the player a special loot drop from a dedicated loot pool specific to that boss they're fighting. Items are more likely to drop from a certain boss basically. An example of this is in Borderlands 2 with the bitch SMG. That's right, and how you have to kill the bunker for an increased chance to get this item. It makes more sense to farm the bunker, as not only you're more likely to get the weapon, but there's other items that will drop along with it. Now in Wonderlands, is this feature present? Well, yeah, it is. There are bosses that have higher chances of dropping certain items, but this is completely overruled by something called the Chaos Chamber, which is an endgame feature that I'll cover at the end of the video. But to break it down, you could go farm a boss for a higher chance of getting a drop, or just go to the Chaos Chamber and have nearly the same, if not much better odds of getting the same item. This makes farming certain bosses seem pointless. Like, I'll do it for the fun, but if I'm looking for a specific drop and I'm on an old character that's already beat the game, I'll just use the Chaos Chamber because it's much easier and much more effective. It feels as if the need for adding specific drops for bosses was meant for if it was your first time playing through the game on a character, as at that point you can't enter the Chaos Chamber, but after you unlock it, you won't find yourself going to boss locations much. So yeah, Borderlands does have this, and I think it works perfectly up until the end game. Now, in all of the Borderlands games, there's some kind of vehicle you can get that's typically equipped with miniguns and rockets, and all other kinds of weapons. Mass weapons of destruction, if you will. But their main purpose is to help you traverse the map much easier, as each location in Borderlands can be quite large sometimes. I personally love the buggies that hover in the pre-sequel, but that's just me. Or maybe the Cyclops from Borderlands 3. But I'm getting sidetracked. My point is that Wonderlands doesn't have any vehicles. Now hold on there. This doesn't mean that it doesn't have any type of way to traverse between areas. First off, there's fast travel, which is standard at this point now for the franchise. But beyond this, what is there? Well, I'm glad you asked. I present to you the overworld. It's the closest thing there is in the game to a car, if you will. You can walk on the overworld, which is the board game, as if you don't know, in this game you're essentially a character on a board game known as Bunkers and Badasses, I think. And in the overworld, you go into third person and can travel on foot over large distances to new areas. I know it's nothing like a car or any other kind of vehicle, but it's the only other way of traversing the map. It makes Wonderlands the only game in the franchise that is without a vehicle. Now, this was a controversial decision by Gearbox, as some of the sandbox areas are massive, like the ones in the snow, but any of the previous cars we've seen in other Borderlands games wouldn't make sense in this fantasy setting, but there's no excuse for no mobility whatsoever. Like, let me ride a broomstick or something cool like that. It's not something that bothers me too much, as the map design is really good in the game, but I do believe that it's wasted potential at the very least, and I would have loved to see some fantasy cars, if you will. So no, I guess Wonderlands technically doesn't have any other mode of transport to help a player traverse the sandbox areas, but I do love the overworld and I think it works with the game perfectly. Me personally, I don't really care about story games, but I will agree that at the very least, Borderlands story is important for the first time you play. That's the bottom line. I prefer to just get new guns, kill bosses, you know, the fun stuff. But if it's your first time playing a game, you need a story to engage the player and keep them interested. Unlike Borderlands 3's story, I actually quite liked Wonderland's plot. Once again, everything was taken a bit too far with the cheesy jokes and unfunny comedy. But ironically, I think it works better for this game compared to Borderlands 3. After all, Tina is the narrator, if you will, along with Valentine and Fret. These three characters frequently remind you that you're just in a board game, and taking a less moralic decision might be easier, as after all, none of it's real. But then Fret will be like, no, let's see where this takes us. And it can get a bit repetitive at times. However, overall, I like the plot of the Dragon Lord, who is voiced by Will Arnett, and how he is basically a real person trying to take control of the fantasy world. He thinks that Tina's unfair and he wants to rule everything, basically. I'm not too sure. It's by far not the best, but still an upgrade from the previous game, and therefore I would argue that there's a decent main story present here. The side quests for the game are a bit wishy-washy. Some are fun and some are just fetch quests, but I won't criticize that too much, as let's be honest here, most quests are fetch quests in Borderlands. It's just what you're getting and the outcome that are different. But to make a point on how cool I think some of them are, I'll mention my favorite, which is one called Walk and Stalk. It has you collect a magical bean that grows into a rather large beanstalk. Does this sound familiar? Anyway, this is like a main story side quest, if you will. You don't have to do it, but it unlocks a lot of content and a whole new area to explore. It features Brick as the fairy punch father, which is cool, and overall it's just so much fun. Looking at it objectively, I'd say that Wonderlands has some really good side quests, so yeah, this is a present feature and it manages to do it really well. If you want to talk about unique weapons, Wonderlands is where it's at. Now yes, it does have a few similar or outright the same guns from other games, but the guns that are specific for this game are awesome. As you are, once again, in this fantasy world, you'll find yourself shooting a crossbow or a magical fairy dust shotgun, or even weapons that rain arrows from the sky. Honestly, the weapon variety is great in this game. I think that it really hit the nail on the head here. But other than the weapons themselves, is there unique rarities like pearlescence? Well, kind of. You see, back to the chaos chamber I was talking about, you can basically go up in a higher chaos level, and the higher level you are, the more likely you are to get one of the 3 extra rarities called chaotic, volatile, and primordial. There's still nothing like pearlescent, but it's the closest thing we've gotten since, I'd argue, and therefore I'd say that Wonderlands does have special rarities. At least it does compared to Borderlands 3. Now, just a short one here. I'd personally say DLCs in Wonderlands failed miserably. It's just like they're all rushed and not very long at all. It just feels like a little build up to kill a boss, which is fun and all, but like, where's the plot? There's a total of 4 DLCs for the game, and I'd say they're mid at best. However, I do like the wheel you can spin outside of the DLC area with souls that you collect from killing bosses and enemies. So I guess it's not all bad, but overall, I'd say that Wonderlands fails on the DLC front. Who is your favorite Borderlands character? Well, it doesn't matter, as there are none of the same classes in this game. There's similar ones, but none of the same. Now, this isn't a bad thing at all. Instead, you'll pick which magical powers you would like to use, and these vary a lot. Some of them even have pets. And once you start leveling up, you have a subclass you can pick from another character type. This leads me on to the leveling part of the game. I don't hate it, but it's definitely different. You'll have the leveling cards of your class that you picked, and at level 7, you'll unlock a subclass and get their cards too. This is a twist on the normal way it functions, but I think it works more or less the same, and there isn't much wrong with it except the fact that the max level's 40, and therefore you only get 2 class cards to level up. Overall, I do like the Wonderlands take on character building, but I still prefer just about any other Borderlands game's way of doing it instead. But it's not bad by any means. And finally, the endgame content. There is a massive lack of endgame content, and this really sucks. The big one, obviously, is the Chaos Chamber, but I get bored of it so quickly, and it slowly becomes the only thing to do once I've beaten the game. Sure, you can get gear someplace else, switch it up, but why would you when in the Chaos Chamber there's such a bigger reward waiting for you at the end? You could also argue that there are side quests, and I agree to an extent, but they're there throughout the whole game. I mean, there's some that you unlock after beating the game, but that's about it. The three things I found myself doing somewhat for fun after I beat the game is the DLCs, the side quests, and the Chaos Chamber. But it almost feels pointless for farming for new upgrades and gear when there's no new game plus. Usually you farm gear before getting ready to beat the game all over again, but by the time you've completed the game once, you're already max level, with the only real thing you can progress and level up being the Chaos Chamber. It's not a bad feature by any means. I do like doing the Chaos Chamber, but because there's nothing else to do, it just gets drowned out and seems boring. So yeah, Wonderlands does have endgame content, but a lack of it. So, I've made my decision. Is Wonderlands a good enough game to be a Borderlands game? Well, yeah. Although there's a lot wrong with the game, which I would like to change, some of the things aren't the end of the world, but I do believe that Wonderlands has the core of what a Borderlands game is, even if it's nullified in some areas. From the maps to the guns to pretty much anything in the game. If you tie it all together, it is a Borderlands game. And that's it. That was my take on Wonderlands, and if it was a good enough game to be a Borderlands game. I hope you enjoyed the video. I would love to cover the Borderlands franchise at some point, so maybe the next video will be on Borderlands 1, 2, the pre-sequel, or 3, but I'm not too sure yet. I do also want to talk about Borderlands 4, but I feel like I'm a bit late to the party with that one, so I'll wait till there's more news about it, and maybe then I'll cover it. But yeah, other than that, thanks for watching, and goodbye.